So we are going to begin a new series in the book of Hebrews. We're eventually going to be on Hebrews 1, page 846 in the Bible's underneath the chairs in front of you if you want to turn there. But as you do, or if you're not, what do you know about the book of Hebrews?
Not about coffee brewing.
It's not about brewing coffee. Hebrews. Men should make coffee in the morning. Probably to some Hebrews. Okay, that's going to give us a clue.
Did Paul write it?
That's a good question. Did Paul write it? Is that one of the things we know about Hebrews? Is we don't know who wrote it. Yeah. One of the few books, maybe the only book in the New Testament that we're really not sure of to a large degree. Well, Hebrews, again, we call it a book of the Bible. There's 66 books of the Bible. But they're really different types of writings. You realize that. There's history, there's poetry, and even in the New Testament, you have the Gospels and Acts, which are largely history, and then you have what we call the letters. And you think about it, it's a letter from a person to either a person or a group, and as such, you'll see that in the letter, from this person to this person or group. You know, for Rome, Paul says, from Paul to the believers in Rome. James says, from James to the 12 tribes. So we know he's speaking to Jewish Christians. And then Peter and his epistles to the Christian exiles of the dispersion. But we get to Hebrews, and look how it starts. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. That doesn't sound like a letter, does it? It's not a letter as such. You can really think of the book of Hebrews better as a sermon. The author himself says in chapter 13, verse 22, it's a word of exhortation. A word of exhortation or challenge. And we mentioned that the author and audience, we don't know for sure who wrote the book of Hebrews. People wonder if it was Paul, and that might be the most common idea, I guess. Barnabas comes up. I've seen a very good case made for Apollos being the one who wrote the book of Hebrews because of what we know about him. We do know it was not one of the original 12 apostles because it's going to talk about in chapter 2 that the author heard the truth from those who initially heard it firsthand, the apostles. The audience, we don't know that either. What specific church it was written to, what area where they lived. One thing we do know about both, just from the letter, is the audience and the author were both very familiar with the Old Testament. And so we're assuming that they were Jewish Christians. That the author had a Jewish background instead of Gentile, and that the audience had a Jewish background. The audience also, it gives us the reason for writing. Why did the author feel the need to write to this group of people? Well, we can see a few things. First of all, it seems that some of them were sort of stalled in their faith. That they had become believers, but they really hadn't matured. They hadn't progressed. In chapter 5, it talks about how they're dull of hearing. They weren't listening and following through. How they should be on solid food, but they still needed milk. And then there's also verses that talk about, especially in chapter 10, how the audience was either being persecuted or facing persecution and tribulation. And then the focus of the book makes it clear some of them were tempted to return to Judaism, to go back, not abandon God, but to abandon Jesus. Perhaps they were being persecuted by Jews. And we see that in the book of Acts and other epistles, how the Jews were against the Jewish Christians. And so maybe that was the case. And so if they'd return just to Judaism, they'd be free of that persecution. Maybe they missed some things that were part of the Jewish religion. It's evidenced by the large amount of Old Testament quotations and references, just constantly. The Old Testament is being quoted, and oftentimes it's not, even mentioned where it's being quoted from. The author knows, they'll know, because they're familiar with it. And a key theme of the book, as you look at it, is the fact that Jesus is superior to various elements and aspects of the Old Testament. In chapters 1 through 3, Jesus is superior to the angels and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. In chapters 3 and 4, he's shown as superior to Moses and the Promised Land. In chapters 5 to 7, Jesus is greater than the priests and Melchizedek. And in chapters 6 to 10, Jesus is greater than the sacrifices and the covenant. So all these points the author is making. You're thinking of going back. Why would you go back to something that's not as good? And so the focus, the point, is these former means of revealing God, and that's what they all were, something that told something about God, something that was part of God's interaction with his people. They weren't bad by any means, but Jesus is superior. Jesus is greater. Jesus is the fuller revelation of God. So remain faithful. Despite the persecution that you're facing, remain faithful. And we're going to see how this applies to us, how we're tempted to look at alternatives in some way, not necessarily to Jesus. I don't know that any of us are considering, well, I think I'm going to become a Jew, but a different version of Jesus maybe, versus the one that we see in the Bible. I'd rather have Jesus this way, or I'd rather have this. I put my priorities there. We're going to see that the Jesus of the Bible is superior to any other alternative. Well, the author begins that focus immediately. In chapter 1, as I read, verse 1, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Who's being contrasted here? What's the contrast? Who is the contrast? The prophets and the Son. So right away, you see this. And he's not going to focus on this one a great deal. But he does bring it up. Now, what's interesting is that all the translations have, God spoke in these last days, he spoke to us by his Son. That word his is not in the Greek. It's not in the original text. And so it really conveys this idea of the one who has the quality of being Son. And so it's talking about Jesus' nature. Jesus' divine nature. And right there you see the superiority, because all the prophets were people. They were humans. They weren't divine. But here's the Son. He is divine. He has the quality of being Son, the Son of God. And so right there, as you look at the two, well, the Son clearly is superior. What's the contrast? What action is the author contrasting?
Past and present.
Past and present, but God doing what in the past and the present through the prophets and through the Son? Speaking to us. Yeah, God spoke to us, he says, in 2 ways. Spoke to our fathers, so he's talking about, again, and clearly the Jews, because their fathers would have been their ancestors, their Jewish ancestors. Spoke to them by the prophets, but in these last days he's spoken to us by the Son. So that's what he's contrasting here. 2 ways of God speaking to us, God revealing himself. And he says that many times and in many ways God spoke to our fathers. What were some of the ways God spoke to people in the Old Testament?
Dreams.
Dreams was one.
Through the prophets.
Through the prophets. So God would tell them something and they tell it.
The burning bush.
The burning bush, there's one. Many ways. Any others you can think about? The tabernacle, some of the things that was a form of revelation about God, yeah? Moses, God would speak to him, and there's a prophet, but, a little different than others. God said, I'd speak to him in a much clearer way than anyone else. I thought of the donkey and Balaam. That's a pretty unique way, isn't it? A message which, again, Balaam, not an Israelite, but eventually came to Israel, a way of God revealing himself. So all these different ways. And you look at that, were any of those ways or messages bad? Were they wrong? No, not at all. Those were ways of God speaking. But how has God spoken to us now by his Son? The things that Jesus said while he was here on earth, and everything else in the New Testament. If you remember before he left, is that there are many more things I have to say to you, but basically you couldn't handle them right now, guys. You're not ready for them. Well, the rest of the New Testament is Jesus speaking. That's why the whole red letter Bible thing always, I thought was a little weird. Like, the whole Bible should be read. It's all revealed from Jesus. And so God has spoken to us by his Son. Well, how is that superior?
It's direct.
It's direct. Well, some of those were direct, the message that they gave.
It's God himself.
It's God himself, so you've got the Son versus the prophets. You could call them sort of servants there. How else? What about the message itself?
Clear.
It's clearer. It clarified some things in the Old Testament, didn't it? Some things that either they, out of their own bias missed, or maybe they just truly didn't, it wasn't clear. It makes it clear in the New Testament. There were things that the angels, we talked about on Easter. And it seemed like Satan himself understood fully what was going to happen. So Jesus clarified things. He went beyond. He gave the fuller, complete revelation. What he did, again, what they said was not wrong, it was not bad, but Jesus came and built upon that. He fleshed it out. He fulfilled it. And so Jesus is superior in that way than the prophets. So right off the bat, you think of what we've had, and he's speaking to Jews. You think of what we've always had, which was great. What we have now through Jesus, that his revelation is even better. But he goes on then to give Jesus' resume, you could call it. And so let's just start again, verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed as the heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Okay. It says, whom he appointed as the heir of all things. I mentioned the fact that there are several quotations here. And sometimes references. We're going to see some that are clearly set off. This is a reference to Psalm 2 where it says, ask of me and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. And this would be something that got clarified. There are many things in the Old Testament they didn't realize was speaking of the Messiah, but the New Testament writers, under inspiration, make it clear. Yeah, that applies to the Messiah. And so this idea, God is saying to his Son, I will make the nations your heritage. That's from God the Father to Jesus as his role in the Son. And so it shows, how does this show the superiority of Jesus? The fact that he was appointed the heir of all things. How does that make Jesus superior? Well, who's the superior person in any kingdom? The king. Well, what's this saying? Jesus is the king. He's the heir of all things. He's in charge of everything there is. I will make the nations your heritage, the ends of the earth your possession. He's the owner of all, the king of all. And then it says, through whom he also created the world. So he being God, but through Jesus he created the world. And we read about this in Colossians chapter 1. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. So it's talking about Jesus being the agent of creation. And when it says he created the world, that literally, the word there is ages. And so it's not just the world itself. It's because of him, everything that has happened in the world has happened. The sum of all periods of time. Okay, how does this show Jesus' superiority?
He's infinite.
He's infinite.
The beginning and the end.
What specific role in his infinite being, what role is this talking about? Creator. Isn't the creator superior to anything else that he's created? Yeah, and everything else has been created. Everyone else. All of the prophets of the Old Testament, all the great figures of the Old Testament were created ultimately by Jesus. All of the things that were used, the tabernacle, the temple, all the things that the Jews, were proud of for good reason. He says, okay, those are great, but Jesus created them all. He's superior. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. The radiance of the glory of God. The idea is he's the rays of the sun as to the sun. You know, the Father is the Son. Jesus is the rays of the sun in the sense he's making that point. And we're not trying to get into the theological nature of the Father and the Son and all that. It's just the fact they're so closely tied. You know, the sun has to have the rays. The rays are there because of the sun. And then the exact imprint of God's nature. This is the idea of the imprint left on a coin from the die. Or the imprint that's left, how they would have their signet rings and they would put those in the wax. Well, that imprint comes directly from that die, from that ring. It's the exact representation of it. Nothing gets closer to representing that die as the image that it leaves on that coin. Well, that's the idea as it's talking about Jesus being the revelation of God. He said, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. The Old Testament revealed God in, again, clearer ways than anything without it. But this is making the point, okay, Jesus reveals him even more so, even more clearly. He's the closest thing you're going to get to God, to know about him. And it says he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Colossians again, chapter 1, verse 16. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. I read that about the creation part, but look at verse 17. He is before all things. He's above them. And in him all things hold together. All things hold together. Now, the Greeks pictured Atlas, maybe you've seen it, holding the world. Remember, on his shoulder? Well, that was the idea of, he's holding it. It doesn't fall because of Atlas. Well, this word that the author uses goes beyond that even. It's not just that he holds it, so it doesn't fall, doesn't break apart, but he is carrying it forward to a designed end. He's not just keeping it going, keeping it spinning, he's guiding it. Jesus is overseeing it and guiding it. And so, how does this show Jesus' superiority?
He's the glue that holds everything.
Yeah, he keeps it all together. Again, especially as you think about the things, and that's why I mentioned them, the things we're going to see. Everything in the Old Testament that the Jews were so fond of, well, okay, Jesus was the one who was guiding all of that. Who was holding it together, and not just that, guiding it, keeping it moving toward the purpose that God intended. It also says there, after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. This idea of making purification for sins is a major point of the Bible. The point of it is going to be, nothing else takes away sin. You're wanting to leave behind Jesus and go back? Well, there was nothing in the Old Testament that truly took away sin. It rolled it forward, it kept the punishment from coming, but nothing forgave, nothing actually purified for sins. Only Jesus could take care of that most important need. And then it says he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Psalm 110 is the reference here. Verse 1, it says, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And there's the idea, David is writing this, the Lord, and as you look how that is, that's the word Yahweh. Yahweh said to my Lord, my master, it's a different word for Lord there. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. So God the Father is saying to Jesus the Son, sit at my right hand. Well, who gets to sit at the right hand? Jesus, the most favored one. Yeah, was that ever said to anyone in the Old Testament? Did God say that to Moses? Did God say that to David? Did God say that to Abraham? All of the figures of the Old Testament that, again, are heroes of the faith. But this author is making it clear, God didn't say that about any of them. Jesus is the only one he said it to. Jesus is superior. Any of those others, they never received that honor. So this idea of Jesus superior is the focus of the whole book. And the point of his superiority is introduced in the opening passage. It says, long ago at many times, we've read this a couple times, and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by his Son, by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. What's the idea, key idea that's being conveyed there? What word is repeated, basically? Spoken. Yeah. God spoke this way in times of old. God spoke this way to us now. He did it in the past, and it was valuable, but it was incomplete. He has now completely spoken to us in his Son. Everything that we need. And the key point, what's the implication of God speaking to us? If God speaks,
he's telling we need to listen.
There it is. We need to listen. You know, there's some people who might speak. Do you listen to everyone who, yeah, and probably for good reason. There's some people who say a lot of things that aren't worth listening to. But he's talking here, it was worth listening to God when he spoke through the prophets, right? That was, how valuable was that? The Old Testament, the scriptures. He says, now he's spoken to us through his Son. You know what? We really need to listen to that. And there's a difference there. You know, what's it mean to listen? Hear? What's it mean to truly hear? Pay attention and do. Yeah, you know, come on, parents. When you said to your kids, you better listen to me, did you mean you better just audibly hear the words that I've said now and then totally ignore them? That's not what listen to me means, does it? And so there's this implication. God spoke then. You should have listened then. He's going to make some points as we go through this. You know, if they didn't listen then, what happened? Yeah, various trouble, right? Yeah, ranging from small things to big things. You know, at times it cost people their life. For 70 years, it cost Israel their freedom. The southern nation their freedom. It was important to listen then. He's going to make the point, how much more important is it to listen now? To listen to what God has spoken to us through his Son.
There's also a different preposition. He spoke through the prophets, but then he spoke by his
Son. Yep.
So there was an intercession there, or some intermediary.
They're right, yeah. God, the prophets, whereas Jesus is God. And so he's speaking by. It's coming direct. Absolutely. Yeah, there's that contrast. Why Jesus is superior.
With Moses, that God appeared before the whole congregation and spoke directly. And the people said, we can't take that. That's too much. You go and talk to God in the fire. We'll stay down here.
Yep.
And God had a need to talk to them directly. And for all those years, he went through the prophets. But God still wanted to talk directly to the people. And Jesus is the way he was able to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, both of those great points. You know, God wanted this more direct communication.
His people were destroyed because of unbelief.
Because of unbelief. And what's the unbelief, really? They didn't listen. Yeah. Yeah, you know, we characterize it as unbelief, but God spoke. They heard the words. It was never, well, you know, gee, Isaiah never told us this, or no, they heard the words. That's why they got mad at the prophets. You know, Jeremiah spoke. What did they do to him? You know, they threw him in a well. We don't like what you're saying. We heard the words, but they didn't truly listen, didn't truly hear, and truly believe, didn't truly act on it. Yeah, and so that's the point that's being made here. This subtle, it doesn't say it, does it? But when you hear that God spoke to us through the prophets, and right then, we're going to, as I said, as we go on to Hebrews, he's going to make the point. You know, what happened when they didn't follow, you know, the Old Testament? What happened when they didn't follow these principles? Okay, how much more important is it to follow Jesus? All the Jews knew this. You know, this is one of the big points of Hebrews, is we've got to refresh our memory, probably. But as soon as as soon as the author of Hebrews said this, and it was read to them in their presence, You know, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets. They all knew. Yeah, but boy, our fathers didn't always listen, did they? And it didn't turn out well when they didn't listen, did it? They knew that right away. It just all went together. Like how glorious it was. Oh, but here's what happened. We need to refresh our memories there and realize, yeah, God spoke. They didn't always listen, and it didn't go well when they didn't. Versus it did go well when they did listen, did it? God made that promise from the very beginning. He says, if you obey my words, here's all the great things that will happen. If you don't, here's the curses. Blessings and curse, that ceremony. So they had that in mind, and that's what the author is drawing on. Boy, if that was true then, we really need to listen now. But we need to make sure we don't fall into those same mistakes that they made then. And that's true not only of Christians in general, it's specifically true in his situation. They wanted to go back to that. He said, don't do that. We have something even more important. So ask ourselves, let's think about this. How well do we listen to Jesus? How well do we listen? Most of the time, but not all. When it comes to this area, but not that one. I like what you said over here, Jesus. I'm all for it, but man, that's not very popular, especially nowadays, Jesus. Get with the times. I don't agree with that. Yeah. We took a poll. Most people don't like that. Better than I used to, and that's enough. I'm doing a way better job of listening to Jesus now. That's good enough. When I can understand why. Ooh. Jesus says to do this. That doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, this other one, the whole do not murder, that was pretty clear. Okay. But this one here, Jesus, do you really know? I don't get how you could say that. I don't get why this is important to you. Why is that such a big deal? All those things. It's not about us. Whether we understand or not. And chances are we do understand on some level. We just don't like it.
I'll get to it when I get to it.
Get to it, yeah. I'm working on it, Jesus. I'm working on it. Well, let's think about that. Let's apply this today. Are there limits to my listening to Jesus? Ask yourself these questions. Are there limits? What can keep us, personalize it, what can keep me from listening to what Jesus has said? And let's answer this one as a group. I don't ever want you shouting out sordid details of your life, but this one I think we can handle. What in general can keep us from listening to what Jesus has said?
Our peers.
Our peers. Peer pressure. That's a good one.
Our own will.
Our own will.
Our fears. Did you say fear or peers?
Here.
She said peers, but fears is another good one, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, man. If I do that, look what's going to happen.
Ignorance.
Ignorance might be some degree there that we don't know. Distractions. And what is it about distractions? Pulls us away. There's some interest to them, isn't it? Like that looks like it's a little bit more interesting. A little bit more, enticing.
Our families.
It could be our family. Maybe, you talk about peers. That would include family, friends, co-workers, all those.
Our own attitude.
Our attitude? What do you mean?
Well, that's why I say sometimes we gotta watch and think about how we are not God. But sometimes we know we should change, but we're like, I don't want to.
All right, so that attitude would be pride.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We might not like to think we're prideful, but if we ever think there's some degree, some way we know better than God, Bob.
Lack of self-discipline.
Lack of self-discipline. So I just don't do it. You mentioned ignorance. I had down here, and sometimes it's not, a lot of the problem with ignorance is I don't know what I don't know. Maybe I think I know already what he said. I've had people at times, like, really, the Bible says that? Yeah, it does. All right, what can keep us from listening to what Jesus has said? And then what does it look like when I allow something else to override Stop and think about that. When I allow something else to override, what's it look like? I think a lot of the times it's not, there's some way that maybe we rationalize it, we reason it. For most people I know, most Christians I know, to absolutely refuse, like, I know God says to do this, I ain't going to do it. I don't see that as much, but some kind of rationalizing. I know Jesus said this, but, I know he said this, and I'm sort of doing a little bit of it. I know he said this, but, it just doesn't work out for, there's usually some kind of rationalization.
We can find a Bible verse that supports us.
Yeah, we can find a Bible verse that, gives us a way out. My buddy from the church in Scottsdale, I found a loophole in Leviticus. Stubbornness. Yeah. And again, rarely is it just this, ain't going to do it, God, don't care what you say. But we find some ways to, make it seem like, okay, reasonable. Is there anything else I can listen to that is superior to Jesus? No. There's things I can listen to, plenty of them. Okay, all these people here fly, and you're going after me. Look at them out there. Go. But there's not superior, and that's the point of this book. You might look at them. It starts off about angels. Angels are so cool, aren't they? They are cool. But the author's going to make the point. They're cooler than Jesus. They're better than Jesus. They're superior to Jesus.
You can listen to false preachers.
You can do that. False preachers, but even sometimes something good, but not as good. They bring my family's first in my life. Doesn't that sound great? Is our family supposed to be first in our life?
America first.
America first, that sounds good, doesn't it? Is America supposed to be first in our life? What's supposed to be first in our life? Jesus, God, yeah. Those other things sound good. They are good. They're not best. And that's the point of this book. What's best? What's best? And then what does it look like to listen to Jesus versus those other sources? What do I have to do at the very end? How do I make that decision? Stop and think about that. In whatever case it is, and I'm getting tempted to listen to this source or whatever, I'm getting tempted to rationalize it. What would it look like to I'm going to listen to Jesus. I'm going to do what he wants me to do. Now, maybe sometimes we do need to apply. The Bible doesn't give step-by-step directions for everything. I need to apply it. If I had trouble with that, talk to another Christian who you feel has some wisdom. But find out what it is. What do I do in this situation? Well, what about you? What other thoughts do you have? What stood out to you today?
I'm in the way.
I'm in the way, Jerry says. What do you mean?
It's like a control thing a lot of times. It's like you want to make the best decisions, but sometimes until you really put your faith in Jesus and ask him to lead you, you're not going to get out of the way.
Right. That goes back to our old self versus our new self. My old self is me living for myself.
Control.
Don't swat that fly. Leave him back there or he'll come up here again. Control is that key word, isn't it? Oh my.
I think we ought to study more so we don't become slack.
Maybe. There's certainly some people who need to study more. There's some people who need to do what they study. James says it doesn't do you any good to look in the mirror if you see your hair's messed up and then walk away and don't do anything about it. You study the Bible all the time, and also don't get to this level that we're talking about. Again, if you just get the facts from the Bible, that doesn't help you at all, other than studying for Bible trivia. It's when you dig down, what's the lesson? What's the idea that this passage is conveying? What's God want me to get from it? And then the application. Okay, how do I need to change in light of this? Yeah.
I
That's what this means when he says he spoke and we need to listen. It's not just listen on the level of observation, not even reflection, it's application.
So one of the tattoos that have been going around like crazy is everybody's getting the tattoo of let go.
Let go,
Let God.
let go and let God. Okay. What's it take to get it to that level that I really, that's the point today. Again, God spoke, we need to listen, but listen isn't just hearing the words. Listen isn't even just memorizing. Wouldn't it be great to have the Bible memorized? You know? Wouldn't it be cool?
Pray for wisdom.
But would it be the best thing you could do? You have the whole Bible memorized and don't act on it? It doesn't matter at all. Doesn't matter at all. And there's where you do need wisdom. How do I apply this? How do I apply this, God, in this specific situation? Anything else?
The beginning of it was kind of like senses. Like God was sight, maybe smell, and Jesus was all senses. You've got your touch, your sight, your every single sense. Jesus was all senses. God was maybe just a feeling.
He was he was definitely a fuller version of that, because even in the Old Testament they had the incense, made me think of the smell and different things. But yeah, he's the fuller version. It's all here. It's a little bit black and white versus color. Like, you can see what's happening on a black and white TV, but can you imagine watching the Rose Bowl parade with all the colors, on a black and white TV? You'd be missing something, wouldn't you? Yeah, and that's what this author's everything he's going to say is like, yeah, what God did in the Old Testament for our forefathers was awesome. But not near as great as what he's done through Jesus. All right.
I'd say Jesus is more than just a prophet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. So prophet is a spokesman for God. He was definitely that, but much more. And once again, because he was God, so he was speaking as God. Yeah.
Because of our selfishness and our need to control, and we think we're wise, I think that leads us to having some accountability and to the fellowship and the community of believers.
It certainly should lead us there. Yeah. When we realize we're not as wise as we think. And yeah, certainly should.